I've been flying the DJI Mavic Air 2 for nearly 5 years now, and it's been my go-to drone for pretty much all of my aerial content, from wide open landscape views to close quarters urban shots. This drone has let me capture some of my favorite and most cinematic photos and videos, but with so many newer drones on the market in 2025, there are some key factors you're going to want to consider if you're thinking about buying the Mavic Air 2. So in this video, I'm going to tell you guys about my experience with it over the past 5 years. And toward the end of the video, I'm also going to tell you guys about my thoughts about the newer DJI Air 3. Let's start off with the key features about this drone. It can take up to 48 megapixel stills, 4K 60 frames per second video, HDR photos and videos, and 8K hyperlapses. It has a max flight time of 34 minutes, max range of 10 kilometers, and a top speed of 67 kilometers per hour. Now let's start with what matters most if you're a photographer or filmmaker, the camera performance. The Mavic Air 2 has a few different modes for taking stills. Single photo, which includes 12 megapixel stills by default, or 48 megapixel stills. Smart photo, which uses scene recognition to produce a single HDR image. Automatic exposure bracketing, which is also for creating HDR images but will give you either 3 or 5 images to work with. Burst mode for shooting high action scenes like sports and takes 3, 5, or 7 shots in a row. And timed mode, which will take stills at specific intervals, which you could use to create a time lapse manually. This variety of photo modes can give you a lot of flexibility depending on the type of scene you're shooting, but I've found myself using the 48 megapixel single photo mode most often because I usually want to pack as much detail into my shots as possible. Looking at this 48 megapixel raw image, you can see that I can zoom in quite a bit without noticing too much loss of quality, but once I get to about this point, you're going to start to see that blurriness, kind of an oil paint looking effect. So 48 megapixels in general is an extremely high resolution, but keep in mind that you're not going to be getting the same quality as you would be with a 48 megapixel DSLR or mirrorless camera because 1, you're working with a smaller sensor, and 2, the way the Air 2 gives you that 48 megapixel image is by stitching multiple images together, meaning you're not actually getting that authentic 48 megapixels that you would from a typical camera. Especially if you're shooting in low light, you'll actually want to use the default 12 megapixel mode instead, since this will generally reduce noise and improve color output compared to 48 megapixels. This is actually something I wish I'd learned earlier because I always assumed that higher resolution will always give you better results as long as you have the storage for it, but this is not true in the case of the Mavic Air 2. Regardless, the image quality is solid and is going to give you enough detail for large prints and way more than enough for social media posts. Now let's get into video, which has been my primary use for this drone for the past 5 years. The Mavic Air 2 can shoot in 4K at up to 60 frames per second, and if you drop to 1080p, you can push it up to 240 frames per second for super slow motion for action shots. It records at a max bitrate of 120 megabits per second, which is good, but not quite as high as newer drones. This means that while the footage still looks great, you might notice some compression artifacts in scenes with a lot of movement like waves, trees, or fast-moving objects. The Mavic Air 2 also has an HDR video mode, which is especially helpful for amateur shooters that want a decent-looking image straight out of camera. Dynamic range for video is honestly an area where I'd say this drone's camera is lacking, so I personally have always opted for the D-Cine-like picture profile, which gives me a flatter image that allows for more dynamic range and flexibility when I'm color grading. However, the Air 2 does not have D-Log or D-Log-M, which are only found on newer DJI drones, and provide even more flexibility during the color grading process. Another area where I've personally found that the Air 2 shows its age is its low light performance. Partly because it has a half-inch sensor, it struggles in darker environments, and you'll notice more noise and a reduced detail compared to drones with larger sensors like the Air 3 or Mavic 3, which have better light sensitivity. In my experience, as long as you avoid shooting too long past sunset, your footage will be usable, but at a certain point, there's just going to be too much noise and not much detail. Now let's get into the Mavic Air 2's flight performance. Overall, this is a pretty reliable drone, and I don't often worry about whether the drone will make it back to me. It offers a maximum 34 minutes of flight time per battery and max 10 kilometers of range. When you take off, the Mavic Air 2's home point will be recorded automatically, and if you lose connection, you shouldn't have anything to worry about, as it'll start returning to home automatically. The Air 2 has 3 different modes to fly in: tripod, normal, and sport. Tripod is going to prioritize precision and stability, so in this mode the drone's speed is significantly reduced and the controls become less sensitive, making it really nice for slow cinematic movements. Normal mode is the default setting for most pilots. This mode is a nice balance between speed, stability, and control, making it ideal for general flying and smooth shots. It has a higher max speed than tripod mode while still maintaining obstacle avoidance, helping you steer clear of trees, buildings, and other objects. I'm personally a more daring drone pilot, I must say, definitely too daring sometimes, and I also find that I get the most cinematic shots when I fly as fast as possible right past whatever objects are around to get that nice motion blur in the foreground. So I typically use sport mode, which is the most aggressive flight mode. This is where the Mavic Air 2 really opens up, reaching speeds of up to 68 kilometers per hour. It's perfect for tracking fast-moving subjects, getting dynamic action shots, or just having fun flying. Beware that obstacle avoidance is disabled in sport mode, which means if you're flying fast and there's a tree or wall in the way, the drone won't stop for you. So you have to be extra careful if you want to get your drone back home in one piece. The advertised max flight time of 34 minutes and max range of 10 kilometers are the absolute maximums that you may get out of this drone. But in my experience, I've never really found myself reaching either of these ranges. It may partly be because I push this drone to its limits and fly it as fast and far as possible a lot of the time, but just know that these stats that DJI advertises are only ever achievable in perfect flying conditions. And to be safe, you should lower your expectations a bit and you should be happy with the Air 2's performance. Overall, I'm happy with the 20 to 30 minute battery life with this drone. However, when it comes to the impressive 10 kilometer range that DJI boasts, my drone typically falls very far short of this. Now let's talk about how the Mavic Air 2 compares to the DJI Air 3, which was released in 2023. The Air 3 brings a lot of upgrades, but is it worth upgrading, especially if you already own the Mavic Air 2? That's going to depend on how much the major upgrades that came with the Air 3 matter to you. At first glance, the Air 3 looks more refined and a bit bulkier than the Air 2. It's slightly larger and heavier, and that extra weight helps with stability and wind, but makes it a little less portable. The Air 3 also comes with the newer DJI RC2 controller, which has a built-in screen, which is a huge upgrade from the Mavic Air 2's RC-N1, where you have to mount your phone every time you fly. The Air 3's camera also got an upgrade with a larger sensor and a dual camera system that includes a 3x telephoto lens. With the Air 3, you get a consistent 48 megapixel resolution from both cameras, which means more detail without needing to switch modes like on the Air 2. Plus, the Air 3's larger sensor size means it handles low light situations way better with improved dynamic range and noise control. The Air 3 pushes its video capability up to 4K 100 frames per second, meaning smoother slow motion footage without dropping resolution. You also get 10-bit D-Log-M, which is a huge deal for color grading, whereas the Mavic Air 2 is stuck with 8-bit color and D-Cine-like. In terms of flight, the Air 3 is just more refined. It has omnidirectional obstacle sensing, meaning it can detect obstacles from every direction, whereas the Mavic Air 2 only has front, rear, and downward sensors. This can make a huge difference when flying in tight or complex environments. In terms of battery life, you get a 35% increase in flight time at 46 minutes. And with the Air 3's OcuSync 4.0, you get twice as much range at 20 kilometers and more stable connectivity in high interference areas. So ultimately, if you're an intermediate to professional level drone pilot and need those more powerful and modern features, the Air 3 may be the drone for you if it's within your budget. So is the DJI Mavic Air 2 still a reliable drone to buy in 2025? Here are my final thoughts. It has good battery life, overall impressive photo and video quality, a solid variety of smart features to let you get creative with your shots, and good obstacle avoidance to keep you from crashing into anything nearby. There are definitely some things that sometimes make me want to upgrade to an even more capable drone. First off, the photos lack the sharpness and detail that I would expect from 48 megapixels. The dynamic range and low light performance for video could definitely be better. The drone often disconnects during flight far before the advertised 10-kilometer range. And lastly, you're stuck with that single 24mm camera, which I find myself being a bit restricted by when I want to get a good variety of different shots. Despite these downsides, I still love having the Mavic Air 2 as my one and only drone. I think its performance justifies the price tag if you're a beginner to intermediate level photographer or videographer, especially if you buy it used, in which case you can get the entire Fly More combo for around $500. If you fly a Mavic Air 2, let me know what you think about it in the comments. Are you considering upgrading to the Air 3 or even something like a Mavic 3 Pro? And if you're still on the fence about buying a Mavic Air 2 this year, let me know if you have any other questions in the comments.